My name is Environics, and I'm the director of the Institute of Islamic Studies. And I want to welcome you to today's webinar series called the Muslims in Canada Data Initiative. Today's series is actually a launch of this initiative, and it's a launch that comes after a number of years of consultations with academics, with policymakers, with major data centers here in Canada, and also members of the Muslim community here in Canada. One of the things that we wanted to do was think about how we as a community of academics located within the University of Toronto can draw upon national expertise and institutional commitments across the board to think about the Muslim experience in Canada. Some of you might have come to an earlier webinar series where we have a different sort of model on an archives project, the Muslims in Canada Archives, which offers records of the everyday of yours and other Muslims' lives at a qualitative level. This initiative is, in a sense, the other side of the coin. It's an opportunity to think across Canada, think at a macro level, bringing large-scale data sets together, in large part because in big numbers are ways to talk about Muslims as it relates to larger policy conversations. The journey of creating MiCDI has been a couple of years in the making. We, again, as I mentioned, we work with a number of organizations, and we did so in the process of thinking about how to create new data, recognizing that there's serious gaps in Canada's data landscape when it comes to Muslims. Of course, creating data is no small matter. It can be very expensive, as some of you know. And so part of what this launch is also the beginning of a fundraising campaign to help us really create the data that we need to begin really thinking together across multiple sectors about the present and future of Muslims in Canada. And we're grateful for the organizations that are coming with us for this project and are joining and supporting us. Just to give you a sense of the few of the organizations that are with us, we want to thank the Environics Institute, and I'll get to introduce someone from there today, for their contributions along the way. University of Calgary has been incredibly supportive through Abdie Kazemipur, who I'll introduce in another couple minutes. The Black Muslim Initiative, the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, Inspirit Foundation, the Muslim Association of Newfoundland and Labrador, the National Council of Canadian Muslims, Tesla Institute, the Canadian Muslim Vote, and others that we're working to develop. We're particularly excited about newly working with the Muslim Association of Canada and Olive Tree Foundation as new partners as we work with them to develop this project. Just to give you a sense of what the webinar is inaugurating. The webinar is an inauguration of a multi-year project, which we hope, based on funding that we can hopefully secure in the next 6 to 8 months. And what it begins is this year and as throughout this year securing the funding for this project. We begin with our data team, who I'll introduce to you. The data team will be developing a survey that will then be applied by Environics. But the survey itself is dependent upon the current census being deployed by StatCan. StatCan is currently implementing a census throughout 2021 that will ask the religious identity question that gives us the ability to disaggregate Muslims from the sample, create a sample model, and along the way then leverage that sample model and the census data with an Environics survey with a large sample set that gives us a representative survey at a more qualitative level. Throughout this process, we will be engaging not just community organizations that support the project, but educational web seminars like this, where we contribute to the data literacy of our various stakeholders. And we continue this both for leadership within Muslim communities, with graduate students, with academics, and an international community. Our hope is that by late 2022, early 2023, we have the Environics survey implemented with Environics providing an Environics Institute leading with a report, followed by a series of papers that are developed in-house at the Institute under the auspices of MiCDI with the guidance from our community organizations on various themes. And so that gives you a sense of what this project is and its scope and scale. So today, you might have been coming for what you thought was an introduction to a problem, which you will be seeing that introduction to the problem, but the problem itself is also setting out a journey, and we hope that you'll be on this journey with us as the years progress in the future. So on this journey, we're led by a wonderful team of scholars, and I'll be introducing them now because without them, there is no project. We have, for MiCDI, a data team. The data team, our executive data team, is made up of 3 people: Abdie Kazemipur, professor of sociology, the chair of ethnic studies, an academic director of the Research Data Center at the University of Calgary. Abdie is not just a scholar, but he's been a terrific friend to me as director. He is he's the visionary of this project, and he's someone who puts his heart and soul into and really helps the numbers that look to me like so much gobbledygook. He gives them life. He gives them a spirit, and it's important that he is a part of this project. Dr. Sarah Shah has been one of my teachers in the last few years, helping me understand the world of data and numbers and all the math that goes into it. I'm not sure I'm the best student of hers yet, but she's phenomenal. She is the author of our 2019 report looking at the Canadian Muslim demographics. She is a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Islamic Studies who analyzes religion as it pertains to gender and family relations. But she's also just a wonderful person to think with, to think big with, and to aspire. I'm really particularly excited on that. Even though right now she's working at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, teaching there and working for Canadian Muslim organizations as a consultant, she's also really thinking hard about public health considerations, particularly in this context of a pandemic. So we're really lucky to have her. And third, though he won't be speaking today, he'll be speaking at next week's webinar, is Keith Newman, who's Senior Associate with the Environics Institute for Survey Research, a nonprofit organization that conducts public opinion and social research on important issues of public concern and change in Canada. He's directed a number of groundbreaking studies, including the first surveys of Muslims and Jews in Canada. But let me also say he's been a terrific guide along the way as we've developed this project and become a friend of the Institute, of MiCDI, and is a key member of our data team. And so today we'll be having both Dr. Kazemipur and Dr. Shah lead us in a discussion. And Keith is here as well for conversations that might also intersect with Environics. So that will also be part of the next week's conversation. So we want to leave a little bit of a cliffhanger to bring you back, but we're grateful that Keith is here joining us as well. So with that, I want to conclude. If you have any thoughts or concerns, if you're interested in the project and our next steps forward, you should feel free to contact me or contact the Institute, and we can follow up with you. But as of now, let me turn it over to Abdie and Sarah, and thank you all for joining us here today.
Right. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Right. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Amber, for the kind introduction. I'm really excited to be a part of this initiative that you are leading at the Institute. We have a presentation that we have worked on collectively with Keith and Sarah and myself. So as Amber mentioned, the part of that presentation will happen in the next webinar. For today, Sarah and myself will be talking about and we'll try to give sort of an overview of the existing data with regard to Canadian Muslims. And I hope that we do not make it too technical or too detailed so that it would bore you. So please feel free if there was any part that we went too fast over, just ask about it and we would be more than happy to provide more details and clarification. So if we wanted to sort of give an essence, give something about the essence of this MiCDI initiative, I would say that it is an attempt to create some sort of larger scale numeric data on Canadian Muslims. And the reason for this is, of course, because such data is not readily available, as we'll talk about in a second, but also because the largest scale numeric data is the only type of data that the policymakers can make sense of and can relate to. And in their policy debates and discussion and thinking, that is the only type of data that will find a way and a place in those discussions. I have attended many conferences in which the policymakers, the community organizations, and the academics have been present. And I have noticed that every time that somebody is presenting something fabulous, but based on some sort of qualitative method that involves interviewing or observing the lives of 15, 20 people, the policymakers immediately get up and leave. Not because they do not appreciate that information, but because they cannot find a place in their day-to-day operations for that kind of data. One of them once told me that, what can I take to my higher up with the study that is based on 15, 20 people? And because the question that I will receive immediately is that, what about the other 37 million people? So we are hoping that through this kind of initiative, through MiCDI, we can address that shortcoming that is out there with regard, particularly with regard to the Canadian Muslims. So this is not a very easy task when it comes to Muslims and when it comes to the Canadian context. With regard to Muslim, we have a lot of information, and this information is coming from the social media, from the mainstream media, from the talks on the street. And because of that, people somehow feel that they know a lot about Muslims, and therefore there is no need for any kind of additional data or information. But these are basically information. They are not data. For information to become data, it needs to be processed somewhat, and it has to have some sort of structure. It has to be collected and generated through some sort of rigorous process. And we have to be able to identify the missing pieces and the shortcomings in the data so that we can improve it the next time around. With the scattered and unstructured information that we get from these sources, we cannot really do much of sort of correction or improvement in our data. So that is one difficulty that is out there with regard to Muslims. The second one is that there is, as many of you know, I'm sure, there is this sort of assumption about Muslims that some, myself, have called it Muslim exceptionalism. Some have called it Muslim distinctiveness. A perception that Muslims have a different type of operating system, and they view things and they behave in ways that are very different from all the other populations. And therefore, and we know how they operate. They operate based on the instructions and the teachings of the religion. And once we go to those scripts and we learn about them, then we know how they behave. So there is really no need to gather any information about Muslims. As long as we know Islam, and we can do that by looking at some of these sort of classic sources, then we know everything that there is about Muslims. So that is a particular situation that exists only with regard to Muslims, not necessarily with other groups. Now, all of those difficulties are multiplied by the fact that we are talking about Muslims in a Canadian context. In the Canadian context also, there are some sort of inherent and structural and historically formed limitations and obstacles that make it really difficult to generate this kind of data that we are talking about. One is that the Muslims and the Canadian society, unlike many other countries, have a very historically a very short term or short history of past interactions. Many European societies have centuries of those past interactions. But in the case of Canada, this history is very, very brief. So that could be a good thing, because that basically means that there are no prior bad images of Muslims in the minds of the rest of Canadians. But it also means that there are no good images of Muslims in those minds as well. So basically, there is nothing that they can check the existing information against and try to sort of correct them or modify them. So whatever information is out there will have an extra weight, because that historical, the weight of that historical past interaction is not there. The second thing is that with regard to when it comes to minorities and to immigrants, Canada has always been treated or viewed as an exceptional case, and that has become a part of sort of the identity that the Canadians have developed as well, that we are very different from all other societies in terms of our treatment of minorities and our immigrant population. And because of that, there is some degree of nervousness, some degree of concern that this image might disappear if we get too detailed and too specific about what is happening with regard to particular minorities. And there are some more general issues as well that are more sort of theoretical perhaps in nature, that because we are operating in environments that are predominantly secular, and also even in academia, the social scientists have been for a long time under the influence of these secular perspectives, we have lost the skills and we have lost the ability to deal with religion in a very effective way. And so we have lots of blind spots. We have lots of confusions and ambiguities when it comes to religion, and we don't have the right tools to understand and to sort of make sense of what is happening with regard to religion. So that reflects itself in the case of Muslims as well, but it is a more kind of general issue. And also there is a higher degree of sensitivity towards particularly Muslims and Jews, because the treatment of Muslims and Jews has become sort of an indicator of an overall shape of the society and the healthy or unhealthy nature of the social environment and the culture. So sometimes people just try to avoid creating any information on this in order to not get into any kind of trouble. So with that in mind, I want, with Sarah, we want to sort of give an overview of what is out there in terms of the largest scale numeric data that I mentioned at the beginning, and what are the, for Canadian Muslims, and what are the some possible advantages and shortcomings in those data. And then that would perhaps make it more clear why an initiative like MiCDI is so timely and so urgent now. If you wanted to look at the data, the existing data, we can put them under these two very broad categories. That one is perhaps a little more, loosely speaking, is more objective, is looking at more objective indicators. The other one is more sort of subjective, in the sense that the socioeconomic data are looking at the information that can be verified by through other sources. The second type of information is more reflection of the perspectives, opinions, attitudes, and experiences that the respondents have had. So for the socioeconomic data, the greatest source that we have, the Canadian source, are sort of the kind of data sets and data that have been generated by Statistics Canada. And Statistics Canada is internationally very well respected in terms of the quality of the data that it generates, and also in terms of safeguarding the anonymity of the participants. So there are lots of sort of high bars that have been set by StatCan in terms of how to deal with this data, that has made it a nightmare for researchers to access those data, but it has created a very high degree of confidence in that data as well. So Canadian Census is the richest and the biggest source of data that we have on Muslims. And the reason for this is that this census is based on a huge sample. As you know, I'm sure many of you have filled out the census questionnaire, but the one that you have filled out most likely has been the sort of the short form, or Form A, or Questionnaire A. And that is like a one-page questionnaire that has just 3-4 questions on your gender, on your age, on the place of living, city, province, or those information. But there is another form that is called the Questionnaire B, or Form B, or the long questionnaire, that has more than 200 variables, 200 questions on that questionnaire. And that is sent to 20% of the population. So 20% of the population with the current Canadian population would be around 7-8 million. And it is a dream for researchers to have a data that has 7 million cases in it. We sometimes work with a survey that has only 1,000 or 1,200 respondents in it. So 7 million, 8 million is a luxury in terms of the kind of work that you can do with that data. So if you look at some of the information that this data is showing us, I'm just giving this as samples of the kind of things that we can extract from this data, and not necessarily getting into the sort of a detailed discussion about what each one of these graphs are telling us. This is, for example, a graph that would show the average income of Canadians by their religious background. This is based on the 2011 census. And as you can see, you can sort of get these larger groups, but you can also break it down by much smaller groups as well. You would be able to tell how each group is doing. And in this case, you will see that the lowest average income has been reported by Muslims. Another indicator that we can use by relying on the census data is the poverty. Again, this is information for 2001, and it is showing that Muslims are reporting the highest level of poverty, and that is not necessarily because there are more sort of Muslims who are immigrants, new immigrants. When you separate the immigrants and non-immigrants, you will still see that among immigrants, Muslims have the highest rates, and among non-immigrants, Muslims have the highest rates of poverty. So that is a very sort of important information to be able to arrive at. That previous one was for year 2001. You will see that in 2011, we have pretty much the same kind of pattern. Again, Muslims are reporting the highest rates of poverty. So there are lots of information like this on educational background, on occupational profiles of Muslims that we can get out of this data. The problem with the census data is that as rich as it is for all this socioeconomic information, if your focus is on religion and you want to see how Muslims are doing compared to other people of other religious backgrounds, there is a limitation there. And the religion question on the census is the one that is asked once every 10 years rather than every 5 years that the census is conducted. So that basically means the latest information that we have is from, at the moment, is from 2011 census. So this year, when the census is done, we will have more information again, and we can talk about Muslims. But then again, we cannot say anything definitive until 2031. So we have to wait for another 10 years. Now, something that I'm happy to report is that the thinking around this issue is has begun to change in the Statistics Canada, different parts of Statistics Canada. And I'm sitting at a committee that gives feedback to Statistics Canada on the kind of data that they want to generate for minorities, ethnic, racial, linguistic minority, and immigrant groups. And it seems that this is the message that they are receiving from the academics, from the community organizations, from many people, that this religion variable has to be included in every census. So that is, I'm hoping that that is going to change very, very soon. But so far, this has been the case, and this limitation is there. And that is, it is curious that the religion variable is the only variable that is like that. So that's that nervousness that I mentioned about religion variable is perhaps a reason for this particular practice. Since Statistics Canada has generated another type of data, which was mostly concerned with immigrants and the performance of immigrants. And that was a wonderful and exceptionally rich type of data. It was called Immigration Database, or IMDb. And what they did in creating this data was that they combined the immigration files from government and immigration, the immigrants' attributes with their taxation information. And through that, they were able to sort of track these different cohorts of immigrants all the way from 1980 to today. And we are able to basically look at each cohort of immigrants and follow them over the years and see how they have done in terms of income, in terms of things related to occupation and income. This is just one example from a project that I'm currently doing on Iranian immigrants. And that is basically showing what happened to the income of these immigrants from Iran who arrived in 1982 in all the subsequent years. And that the two lines that you see there, one is for the Iranian immigrants, one is for immigrants from any other country. So basically you would be able to follow them over the years, and to be able to follow a group for about almost 3 decades. That is a huge thing to be able to do that with the data. So it reveals a lot of things about what has happened, because we are focusing on one cohort of immigrants, one group of people. So we can do this for all the years and for people from all national backgrounds. I focus on Iran here, but you can include any other country. If we do that, you'll get something like this. Very crowded and colorful figure that looks very impressive, but probably very useless as well, because there's so much noise in that data that we cannot do much about it, and you have to sort of refine the picture in order to arrive at anything meaningful. But I just wanted to include this here so that you see that there are all sorts of possibilities there, and I also wanted to impress you with this as well. So that data is there. The problem, a minor problem for us if we want to focus on Canadian Muslims, is that you cannot identify Muslims in this data, because the religion variable is not there, because no question has been asked about religion in the immigration files or in the taxation data. Therefore, you won't be able to compare Muslims with others. Out of this recognition, Statistics Canada developed a different type of data set, generated a different type of data that was called the Longitudinal Survey of Immigrants to Canada, or LSIC. And in this data, they looked at one group of immigrants who arrived in Canada around 2000, 2001, and they followed them over the next 5 years. And basically they asked a whole bunch of questions related to their job and income and education and those kind of things, but also there were a whole bunch of questions related to their ethnic and religious and linguistic backgrounds. So that, with using that, we would be able to see how Muslims are doing over time. This is again a sample of something from one of my books that in which I have compared Muslims with all other people of all other religious backgrounds, and again, it has some degree of longitudinal nature because we are able to follow them over the years after they have arrived. And what you see here, again, that blue line is showing that in all these years, for this group of immigrants who arrived in 2001, in all the years from the beginning to the end of that survey, they were reporting the lowest income compared to all other immigrants. There was another question in that survey which was interesting. It was asked, what was your experiences like? Was it better than what after migrating to Canada? Was it better than what you anticipated? Was it worse? And almost all groups said that their experiences have been better than anticipated or expected, and the only exception is Muslims. That they after second year, for some reason, their experiences have shown have started sort of moving down and in a negative direction. So these are incredible information that we can find that are longitudinal in nature and report the experiences of different religious groups. But the problem with that is that that survey stopped at 2005 because the longitudinal surveys are so costly. Statistics Canada was not able to follow these people, and therefore we can only report things for Muslims and comparing them with other religious background, people from other religious backgrounds for only this particular period, for just one cohort, and from 2001 to 2005. So as I was working with this data, I thought that there might be a possibility to expand this time frame by linking this last type of data with the previous one, by linking the longitudinal survey of immigrants with immigration database. And I spent a lot of time negotiating and bargaining with the Statistics Canada to see whether they would accept linking these two types of data. And eventually, credit to them, they finally agreed. So a new data was generated that was so powerful because we had all that religious background information now combined with the IMDb data that would trace the income of people over the years. And we were able to look at what we just looked at, but not stopping at 2005, but going all the way to 2016, 17, 18, which is the latest IMDb data available. When I did that, this is basically what we found, that for Muslims, this is the data on the average income of Muslim women who were in the sort of labor force, and they reported and they filed their taxes in 2002, that is 1 year after their arrival, and then compared to 2016, which was the latest year for which we had the IMDb data. And as you can see again, it was the lowest in 2002, and it is the lowest in 2016 for women. For men, the average, the level of average income is a bit higher, but the pattern more or less remains the same. In 2002, Muslim men were the second lowest group. In 2016, were the lowest. So there are these possibilities in the data, but combining these different types of data sets will create such a complex situation that we just need a lot of sort of computing power in order to be able to sort out and squeeze out useful information out of that. One of the problems with all of those things that I showed you was that they report income by religious background without controlling for the other variables. So it is quite possible that someone would argue that, yes, Muslims are reporting a lower income, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there is some sort of bias in the job market against Muslims, or they are having an experience, a negative experience as a result of their Muslimness. It could be that they have lower education and their lower income is because of that. They could be that there are more, for example, refugees that among Muslims, and we know that refugees tend to report a lower income. So there are all sorts of other variables. Age could be a factor, gender could be a factor. And the only meaningful information that we can get out of this is when we are controlling for all these possible impacts of other variables. This graph that you're looking at has done just that. So controlling for the impact of all these confounding variables and factors, this is showing the pure impact of religious background on the income of people from different religious backgrounds, including Muslims. What you will see in 2003 to 2011 is that there are certain groups that are advantaged because of their religious background, certain groups that are disadvantaged. All those that are below that black line are disadvantaged, and the one above it is advantaged group. So there are some people that are receiving some sort of reward in the job market and in terms of income because of their religious background, and some that are being penalized because of it. The good news in this figure is that both of these groups are losing their advantages and disadvantages that are attributed to their religious background. So as you see from 2003 to 2011, they are just converging almost. That means that they are just moving towards some sort of average in which the religious background doesn't play much of a role in determining their income. But somehow in 2011, things started changing, and things started going back to where they were back in 2003. So again, you will see that in 2015, Muslims became again disadvantaged because of their religious background. And this is something that cannot be attributed to any of those other factors that I mentioned. So this is a very powerful and refined picture that we can get by using this data sets. One problem, as I mentioned, is that because I'm using, or we're using LSEC, or Longitudinal Survey of Immigrants to Canada, and we know that that survey captured the experiences of only one cohort of immigrants, then basically all of these things that I mentioned are applicable to that one cohort that arrived in 2000, 2001. What happened to all the subsequent cohorts of Muslim immigrants, we can't tell much about them because the data wouldn't allow us. And lastly here, in terms of the socioeconomic data, there is this new initiative in Statistics Canada that is trying to link a whole bunch of existing data that they have generated with the kind of data that comes from different government departments. They call it administrative data. For example, from immigration, from health, from police departments. And they have called this project the sort of the linking of the data project. And if that happens, then there will be a lot of flexibility in terms of the kind of things that we can learn about the experiences of different groups. So we would be able, for example, to link the income with the health variables, with the experiences in terms of the police treatment, all of these information and immigration database, any other government generated data can be linked with the existing StatCan generated data. And that would be a huge leap forward in terms of the kind of things that we can do with data, the kind of things that we can learn. The problem with this, of course, is that because of the different natures of these data and data generation practices in different departments, there are all sorts of complexities and different sort of institutional cultures that have found their ways in the ways that data have been generated, that a researcher has to sort of work with these and sort of find meaningful information out of this mess of sort of complexity that is there. And that is going to be a challenge for the future, and it would be a great advantage, but also a great challenge. And that requires a lot of, as I mentioned, sort of the computing power, but also a lot of sophisticated thinking, methodological thinking, statistical thinking, in order to find useful information out of this rich amount of data that is out there. So I will stop here, and these were straightforward and easier stuff that I could talk about. The more difficult ones are the ones that Sarah is going to talk about. Sarah.
Thank you, Abdi. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so you've seen how data can help us understand the socioeconomic status of Canadian Muslims compared to other Canadians or to Muslims in other countries. Now we'll take a closer look at other social experiences that we can capture using surveys, like the experiences of discrimination and related items. Currently, if we want to tap into that kind of data, we could turn to the General Social Survey. The General Social Survey is administered by Statistics Canada and is offered most years, but different themes are featured in rotating schedules. One of these themes is social identity, and that survey was last collected in 2013. The next wave of that survey is currently being collected. In 2013, Statistics Canada was given money to increase the sample size of immigrants in the survey sample. And because the majority of Canadian Muslims are immigrants, this oversampling of immigrants allowed for more cases of Muslims in the sample as well. The General Social Survey on Social Identity asks questions about religiosity as well as experiences of discrimination. This is useful for us as it allows us to compare the experiences of Canadian Muslims with Muslims in other countries. It allows us to compare the experiences of Canadian Muslims with non-Muslims, and it allows us to compare groups of Muslims so we can understand the diversity of experiences within the Canadian Muslim population. We'll look at each of these advantages a bit more closely. First, that the data allows us to compare the experiences of Canadian Muslims with Muslims in other countries. Here we've highlighted just a few examples of surveys available in other countries that capture Muslim-specific experiences. Except for the Environics Institute's survey of Muslims in Canada, which we'll get into in a few slides, we actually don't have data sets in Canada that can compare with these other countries. And this is concerning, especially when we consider the fact that Muslims make up a higher proportion of the population in Canada compared to some of these other countries. And while the General Social Survey can help us look into some social experiences, it doesn't include Muslim-specific questions as these other surveys do. MiCDI survey of Muslims can help us gather data for better comparisons and a deeper understanding of Canadian Muslim experiences in relation to Muslims in other countries. The data would also help us compare Muslim and non-Muslim outcomes related to discrimination. I'll explain the graph in a moment. First, I'll state that the survey data can help us compare Muslim and non-Muslim outcomes, including those related to discrimination. Here, I'm highlighting data from the Detroit Arab American study, which I have listed here. It's an American study, which was collected by a team of researchers in Michigan. This data allows us to compare experiences of Muslim and Christian Arab Americans. What the data shows us is that Muslims experience a lot more discrimination than Christians, and that discrimination is significantly related to distress or to negative emotional experiences. Given this, we would expect to find that Muslims who experience more discrimination would also have higher levels of distress compared to Christians. However, they don't. Muslims are not significantly more distressed than Christians. This finding calls into question the assumption that Muslim religiosity is necessarily bad for mental health, which is something that researchers claim based on assumptions or anecdotes and not on representative data. Here, I've provided a graph that plots Muslim religiosity, discrimination, and distress. What I found is that those who experience discrimination, so the dotted line, for those who reported increasing importance of religious practices, their levels of distress actually decrease. So this finding indicates that Muslim religiosity is good for mental health, which challenges assumptions that researchers and healthcare practitioners make about Islam. With more data and additional measures, we can use empirical evidence based on representative data to challenge more assumptions that are made about Islam and about Muslims. I'm going to turn now to the third advantage of survey data, that it helps us better understand the experiences of different groups of Muslims. Here is a graph using data from the 2013 General Social Survey. It provides the discrimination experiences of Canadian Muslims broken down by gender and racial identity. Here we're focusing on Black Muslim experiences. What we see is that compared to other groups of Muslims, Black Muslim women are significantly more likely to experience any kind of discrimination, be it based on gender, ethnicity, skin color, physical appearance, religion, or language. It is important to recognize this, as it allows for us to understand how Canadian Muslim experiences are shaped by other social dimensions like race or skin color. And so we understand that Muslim experience is racialized, and within that process, there are additional layers of racialization. There are limitations to this kind of data as well, though. I've already mentioned the lack of Muslim-specific questions in the General Social Survey. There's also the issue of low counts of Muslims, even within the oversampling of the 2013 GSS. For example, if we look at the sexual orientation of Canadian Muslims, the GSS does not capture Muslim women who are homosexual, and we know that this population exists. Other groups of Canadian Muslims that are very small and are not well represented in the survey data, for example, Muslim refugees, other ethnic minority groups of Muslims, and so on. We would need larger sample sizes of Muslims specifically to capture these groups. This is the objective of the Environics Institute's survey of Muslims in Canada. I won't speak too much about the survey of Muslims in Canada today, as we will be covering the survey in more detail at our next webinar. I do want to briefly mention advantages of the Environics survey, which allows us to do things that the GSS is not equipped for. The survey of Muslims in Canada was developed in response to surveys in other countries administered by the Pew Research Center. And so this survey allows us to compare the experiences of Canadian Muslims with Muslims in other countries on questions relating to Muslims specifically. The survey was developed in consultation with Muslim scholars, leaders, and organizers. And because there are multiple ways of this survey, we can capture changes over time to see how the Canadian Muslim experience is changing, which may either be for better or worse. Building on these past two surveys, in partnership with the Environics Institute, MiCDI will function to serve this vital role in data collection, analysis, and support. Specifically, MiCDI will create a go-to hub for Muslim leaders, organizers, researchers, and policymakers who want to base their programs, policies, and support provisions on real data about Canadian Muslims. MiCDI will expand the representation of Muslims in existing data, which will also support better analysis and reporting on Canadian Muslim outcomes and experiences. MiCDI will also facilitate and generate new data directly related to Muslim lived experiences. MiCDI will ensure that the data is accessible to Muslim communities, leaders, and organizers. And as many of you know, data like the GSS, for example, is currently restricted and very difficult to access. So having easier access to data is something that's very important to everyone here today. I'll stop there, as I want to give you time to ask questions that you may have for us, but I'd like to first quickly mention the next webinar next week, where Dr. Keith Newman of the Environics Institute and I will further discuss improving our data and understanding of Canadian Muslims. And now I'd like to open the floor to questions that you may have for us.
So I've been monitoring the Q&A function, and there's a number of questions that are there, but let me start with the first one that was asked, and this probably goes to Abdie in one of the charts. one of the attendees asked, what does Eastern religion mean?
Yes, this is a practice by Statistics Canada that every time that there are smaller groups, they are just combined into one broader category so that the individual members of those communities cannot be identified through the data. Eastern religion basically refers to a combination of those from the Sikh community, the Hindu, Buddhist, all of those are put into one broad category.
Thank you. Sarah, one of the questions is really about disaggregating data and thinking about race, which you addressed in one of the slides. But I'm wondering if you could elaborate on some of the work you've done in this area. You've also helped me understand a little bit more about how you think intersectionally on that. So, the question focuses specifically on race, and so I'm hoping you can address that. But you also have a much more intersectional approach to the way you think about data. Could you elaborate on that for us, and what that would mean in the context of MiCDI and its output?
Thank you, Anvar. I'm not clear on what the question is, though. Can you repeat that?
Sure. Well, the question is, when disaggregating data, do you account for the variable of race? It would seem that the intersection of race and religion would be very important to track, especially with respect to employment. And you do address that in one of your slides, but I also know from your other work, you think beyond race and religion, you account for other forms of intersectionality. So if I could add on to the question, if you could introduce us to that framework that you bring to the work.
For sure. So where the data allows, we do disaggregate according to racial identity. Also, immigration status is very important. Knowledge of language, of official languages in Canada is also very important. There are additional measures of social identity and demographics that impact individuals' outcome. The challenge that we have, though, is the availability of data to do this. Oftentimes, the counts are so low that although we're able to generate some numbers, they're not reliable. We don't know how representative the data might be, given the fact that it is a very small sample size when you start cutting populations across multiple identity categories like that. And so that's one of the reasons that MiCDI is so important.
So the questions are rolling in. So let me maybe ask 2 questions at a time, and then I'll turn it over to the 2 of you. So Amira asks if we'll be able to dig deeper to understand why economic outcomes are worsening as compared to other religious communities. So that might be going towards Abdie and one of the slides that you have. And Naveen, my colleague over at Emmanuel, welcome Naveen, is asking if we're tracking Islamophobia in any way, which is important, she thinks, for understanding statistics on Muslims in Canada. So why don't I throw those 2 questions out to the 2 of you?
Yes, the trend that you notice that indicates sort of the worsening of the situation over time, and especially after 2011, this was just a recent discovery because of the availability of this particular combination of data. So in order to, we have identified the problem, but now, as you mentioned, we have to dig deeper in order to find the reasons behind it. And so we are not quite there. And also this data might not necessarily be adequate for addressing all those subsequent questions. So we need more data and we need more analysis. To some extent, we would be able to sort of identify some of the sort of general trends with the existing data. But again, if you want to arrive at a more refined picture, we definitely have to have more data. And we don't have that at the moment.
If I could jump in, can you hear me, Anvar?
Yeah.
Yeah, just to address the question about Islamophobia. So the Environics Institute surveys, the 2 that have been done, actually did address that, both from the experiences of the Muslims that we interviewed and their experiences. But what wasn't mentioned is when we did those surveys, we also did companion surveys of the non-Muslim population in Canada, and we're able to track the attitudes of the rest of the population towards Islam and towards Muslims. And so we do have measures from previous surveys about this. And this is certainly the intention that we have to continue measuring these things in the future surveys that we want to do.
Another question is, let's see, there's so many of them. Is there any data or information on Muslim overrepresentation or interactions with the justice system? And is it possible to organize that kind of data by province, age, or race?
I think that data, that last initiative that I mentioned, the sort of the availability of administrative data and the new approach by the government to make as much data of this nature accessible and available to the general public and to the academic community. I guess if that happens, and there have been some new and recent initiatives between the Statistics Canada and the police department in order to sort of combine their data. So when that becomes available, I guess it would be possible, but I'm not sure if at the moment such data is available.
There's another oh, go ahead.
Sorry, just to jump in. I think just very quickly, that is another topic that we could address in the surveys that we hope to do, interaction with the justice system. So it's the kind of measure that could be added.
There's a question around, we've been talking a lot about StatCan and federal agencies that do data collection. But one of our questions comes about from the City of Toronto and as well as Ontario provincial government. And the question is, the City of Toronto is embarking on a data for equity strategy, which will include the question on religion. The Ontario provincial government, through its anti-racism directorate, is also developing data sets. Are there plans to leverage that data? Maybe if I could broaden the question to the panelists, if maybe you could think about, if you could address, the relation between the federal, provincial, and municipal data collection and how that might work to our advantage or not.
I think that falls under that linking of the various types of data that are generated by different at different governmental levels. We are still way behind where we can sort of effectively use this kind of combination of data. And so the data that is generated by each province, by each city, remains very localized and remains accessible only just in itself, not necessarily in connection with other types of data. So whether we can take on something like that through MiCDI, that would be an interesting angle to look at and to discuss further. It would be a huge undertaking, so I hope that with the increased capacity of MiCDI, we would be able to take on some of those as well.
Abdie, Aisha Tamur asks if the dip that you identified in 2011 in the immigration data could be caused by the arrival of large numbers of Syrian refugees.
No. And the reason, as I mentioned, is that that data came because we were able to link two other data. The LSIC, which was looking at those who arrived in 2000, 2001, and then their taxation information and following them over the years. So that data was just reflecting the experiences of those Muslims who arrived in 2000, 2001. So nothing about the Syrian refugees was there.
There's a lot of questions about what MiCDI will study and focus on. Anything from will we be looking at experiences of visible Muslims, such as women who wear hijab or not, or non-visible Muslims? Will we be looking at house ownership or whatnot? And I'm wondering, maybe this is an opportunity to think about how MiCDI decides its focus. And so if I might jump in my role as director of the Institute, one of the ways that we want to situate the project is, on the one hand, we have a governance model where we have the data team, the 3 people that are here, who are designing the survey itself. We have a community forum with our organizations and others who are, and the organizations that reflect a wide range of Muslim stakeholder communities and who are helping us on the funding of the project. We have an international advisory body made up of scholars and other practitioners within the field, including members from the StatCan community who have been supportive of this project. And of course, my team at the Institute working alongside our data team just to make the project work and ensure all the details are taken care of. And the idea around the topics are as follows. On the one hand, in the interest of academic freedom, we're a university-based project. So academic freedom is our core principle and it's our guiding principle. And so on the one hand, the data team will design the survey. However, it's always in consultation with our community colleagues who are supporting the project and our advisory board who are also ensuring academic merit and rigor to the project. The range of topics will vary based on those consultations. The idea is to make sure that we're consultative and so as to calibrate the research with the range of issues that are out there. We know that not everyone's focal points or priorities are going to be represented in this first go around. Our hope is that by creating MiCDI, by seeding it with this initial project, as expensive as it can be, we can create the beginnings of a data hub where these can be systemic questions that we cement now and into the future. And that's why we're really excited about launching it with all of you here. And so some of these questions that you've asked, we can't answer because we're at the beginning and it would be presumptuous for us to do so in large part because we haven't done the consultation process. They're all fascinating questions. They're all important questions. But the idea is how do you integrate them in a survey, maintaining longitudinal relevance with the Environics surveys that came before, with StatCan data that's developed, the survey sample that's designed from the 2021 census. And so I want to just be really clear about that, is that the areas of interest are not yet predetermined. It's in consultation. And of course, the consultation is dependent upon us getting the project on the ground from a funding perspective. And so we are grateful for the interest and we look forward to talking to all of you who have strong feelings about what should be focused on. So please stay in touch with all of us. So in that vein, let me ask a little bit about one of the questions were data security. And maybe this is a question for on the Environics side in terms of the survey data, the raw data, and for Abdie and Sarah, how the StatCan data, what exactly is done with the data? Who holds it? Where is it housed? What are the access points? And how do we control for misuse of data?
Perhaps I'll start from the Environics side. So for the surveys that we do, first off, the surveys are done in a sense anonymously, in the sense that we do not get full contact or identifying information, and we don't record that information in our files when we conduct the surveys, unless we've asked specifically for any follow-up purposes. So, so the information is not, people are not identifiable, and we operate under certain guidelines and regulations and laws, both federal and in the research industry, that include safeguards to ensure that the information is secure. And anything that that might get shared has no kinds of identifying information whatsoever in the files. And most of what we publish is aggregate data, and access to data files is controlled through license agreements. So some of the general guidelines that we follow when we do our research. Certainly we could provide more details if someone wanted to know.
StatCan.
Yes, as I mentioned, Statistics Canada has one of the most rigorous and strictest, or the most strict procedures and guidelines in terms of accessing the data and who is going to access the data that they generate. They normally produce three types of data, three types of output out of the data. First is some sort of aggregate tables that are available on their websites and everyone can look at them. Then there is a second version that is called the public use data, which is the raw data, but some of the key variables that might lead to the identification of individual respondents are removed. So, for example, the geography variables like neighborhood, sometimes cities even, are removed from that. Some of the sensitive information are aggregated in a way that they are reported in broad categories like income, for example. And so those become available to academics in all universities if they are interested in. And then there is a third one that is called sort of the master files of the data, which includes those sensitive variables as well. But those are available only through some Statistics Canada facilities that have been created. 32 of them have been created across the country in different universities. They are called research data centers. And those are the most intimidating, high security environments that you can find anywhere in the country. So when you go there to work with this data, you cannot have your phone on you, you cannot take any notes, you cannot, there is no access to internet access, there is no possibility of printing anything, there is no possibility of saving any files. So basically, you get into a very cold, intimidating environment to work with that data. So a lot of researchers complain about that, but those restrictions that they consider very limiting, but the StatCan has been very adamant about sort of enforcing them. So the data is on StatCan networks, when it goes beyond that, it has to be sort of accessed through all these rigorous processes. So it is a very safe environment, and StatCan has an international reputation for that as well.
Thank you so much. So Amira Al-Ghawabi wants to know the brass tacks. What are the timelines? When can we be sharing some of this information? What are we looking at? And I know I outlined some of that in the beginning, but I know the three of you have been thinking robustly about this. So why don't I turn it over to you?
So I'll jump in here. So Anvar, you had shared a timeline on one of the slides. If you could pull that up, that would be great. Pardon?
I'll try to pull that up right now.
Yeah. So survey design and administration takes a few years. This year, we're working on developing relationships with community partners and being able to raise the funds that are necessary to take on this kind of data collection. Following that, we'll be developing the actual survey and the content in close relation with the data team and our academic advisors. And then after that is when the survey would actually be collected, and that would take at least a year. So we're looking at a few years before we'd be in a position to share and analyze data. And that's just part and parcel of this kind of process. Abdie or Keith, did you want to add to that?
Just a couple of quick points. I think a key aspect of the timeline is that we need to wait for access to the 2021 census, as I think Anvar said up front. We need the current census data on religion in order to have the right sample frame to properly sample the Canadian Muslim population. And the current sampling frame available is from 2011. And that's way too outdated. So we hope to get access to the 2021 data on religion by sometime in 2022. And by that time, have the survey instrument ready to implement in the field. So that really is why we will not be doing the research before then. In theory, we could be ready sooner, but that sampling frame from the census is absolutely critical. I don't know that it'll take a year to collect the data. I think we could be a little quicker than that, but it will take a number of months to do it properly. And of course, as Anvar mentioned, there's going to be a lot of consultation with academic experts and stakeholders, because as is clear, there's so many areas to cover, there's so many questions to address, we can't do them all. we need to go through a very conscious process of looking at the opportunities and figuring out what are the most important priorities for this next survey.
And just for Amir's benefit, one of the things that I'm really excited about MiCDI at the Institute is that once we have the team develop the sample model from the census and then implement the survey, and then Environics produces its report, at the same time, we'll have a postdoc at the Institute as part of this project, working on thematic oriented policy papers, drawing on both sets of data from both sources. The idea then is through the consultation process with our community partners and our advisory board, we're able to generate a series of follow-up papers for you and others to benefit from and support advocacy in a variety of fronts. And so, and as I like to say, once we've got the ability to hone in and develop these data sets, my hope is that others will see them as sites for other research. So it might not just be one postdoc, but maybe it'll be one of Abdie's doctoral students writing, or someone else from another university, and all of a sudden we have the beginnings of a data set or set of data collections that can center the Muslim experience in robust ways for a variety of studies. So that's the idea, is to create that momentum now through MiCDI.
And if I can add just a quick point that maybe at the beginning, when we are making this sort of initial investment of time and resources into creating this platform, it might take a bit longer to get to where we can use actually data. But once we have that infrastructure in place, then it is much faster, because then people are aware of the need and the resources, some resources are there, and therefore we would be able to utilize the existing data in a much quicker way.
There is a clarification question that came up from earlier discussion on the poverty levels for Muslims. Is there, the question is there consistent low performance on income or poverty attributable only to that one cohort of 2001, or does it apply to all Muslims in Canada? And if it's the latter, what's the latest overall economic situation of Muslims, or if that's determinable at all?
Yes, that was based on the census data of 2001 and 2011. So it was not just one particular cohort, it was looking at the overall Muslim population as much as they were represented in that 20% sample that I mentioned at the beginning in census long form sample. This is a much more representative data, because it is not focusing on just one group of immigrants, or it's not focusing on immigrants. It could be second generation Muslims, for example, that are included in the data. Now, the latest information has to come from this survey that is going to be conducted this year, 2021. So the latest that we have at the moment is 2011. As I mentioned, because religion question is not asked in every census, then they have to wait every time for 10 years before the next round of data is going to be available. So hopefully when the census is completed this year, within the next 2 years, then we will be able to update that information.
Abdie, if I could just make one more point about the census. You know, this is especially important for the Muslim population, because the Muslim population is one of the fastest growing in the country, and is much more changing much more quickly over time than most other populations in the country, which are much more stable and don't have a lot of change in the same way. So in particular, it's the Muslim population which is evolving very quickly. So even being a couple years old would be an issue.
I'll also add to this, using the 2011 National Household Survey, which was like a step in for the census. The data do show that third generation Canadian Muslims fare a bit better, a bit more on equitable terms as non-Muslims, but this comes down to the problem of using cross-sectional versus longitudinal data. It's not clear if it's just a feature of earlier immigrants that they were able to integrate economically better than more recent immigrants, or if things are actually getting better or not for Muslims. So this is why we need longitudinal data to be able to track this.
If I can add a quick point about 2011 census data or national household survey, that some of you might remember that at the time there was this huge controversy that the Harper government created by making the sort of completion of that long form census voluntary rather than obligatory. And if you remember, at the time, there was a petition that was created by academics, former government officials over this, in objection to this. And also the Chief Statistician of Canada, Munir Sheikh, resigned over this decision. The reason was that when you make something like that, such a crucial piece of information voluntary, then the experiences in similar cases have shown that the minority groups, the immigrants, the lower income groups are the ones that are more likely not to participate in the survey. So the data that gets generated out of that that kind of sort of practice is much more positive, because the lower income group are not there, the minority groups are not there. So it creates an image of the society that is much better than what it really is. So there are lots of consideration of this nature that have to be kept in mind when we are analyzing this data. So if in 2011 there are some improvements, and there are some improvements that are reported for Muslims, this could be because there is an actual improvement that has happened, or it could be because of the biases in the data.
There's a question from our friend Irfan, who's a friend of the Institute on a number of projects. But actually, it raises a project that Abdie, Sarah, and I were working on earlier. But so the question is, will the research be able to show differences between different denominations or sects of Muslims? And so, you know, if I might add on to the question, as StatCan asks the religion question, what does it mean to ask religion? How is it defining it? What are the I mean, because every religion has its own sects and denominations. Can you advise us on the nature of the question itself and what it might tell us?
I can speak to that. On that committee that I mentioned, I'm sitting at sort of advisory council for the minority statistics, minority group statistics. The question of religion has been the one that has taken so much time, and the StatCan folks have been just consulting with different people in terms of how to operationalize a definition of religion that is thorough. It includes all the subcategories and everything. And also, it is not something that would would take into account the sensibilities in the Muslim community as well. So it is an extremely difficult thing to come up with the right categorization of any group, basically, including Muslims. But the data is produced with all those subcategories and sects and different branches in mind. The issue of reporting that data is a totally different thing. So we have to create some sort of, if you're interested in that kind of data, we have to create a demand for that. We have to articulate that demand so that the StatCan gets involved in reporting those secondary groups or the data on those secondary groups as well.
If I could add to that, I think this speaks to the shortcomings of more like widely accessible data like the General Social Survey that does not include Muslim-specific questions. So the Environics Institute Survey of Muslims in Canada does tap into sectarian denominations, and it asks those questions. It also asks questions that are specific to Muslim religiosity. I noticed a few questions on whether or not we'll compare the experiences of visible Muslims like hijab donning women. The Environics Institute does include questions about whether or not individuals wear hijab, in addition to a number of other questions specific to Muslim religiosity that are not included in more general social surveys.
So,
and I think,
go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry, just to echo and build on what Sarah said, I think certainly the upcoming research will look at that again. I think the limits will be the size of the sample that we can mount, and the challenges of perhaps adequately representing individuals from sort of smaller groups within the Muslim community. And I think it'll be one of the areas that we'll be looking at as we're consulting and talking to the community and stakeholders and identifying what the priorities are. But I think just to echo once again, I think the value of doing the survey research that we have in mind is we can customize it appropriately to address those priorities that the community collectively identify.
I know that we're running out of time, so there's two questions that are left. One I think I'm going to direct to Sarah, and the other one I'll take the last one. So the question for Sarah really is a combination of a couple questions. One is, community organizations have been collecting data or been working on issues of data, and our friend Nuzhat Jaffrey over at CCMW has also mentioned the work you're doing with CCMW as well. We're really fortunate to have CCMW as part of this project as well. So I was wondering if you could reflect, Sarah, on the work community organizations have already done, the data that exists, and the way that can be integrated within this work.
For sure. I'm very grateful to community organizations for having done the foundational work that they have done. But I know one of the shortcomings of that work is that they do tend to collapse the experiences of all Muslims together, and don't look at the experiences of diverse Muslim groups or differences within Muslim groups. So things like added barriers or difficulties that immigrants or individuals who don't have knowledge of official languages or individuals of precarious legal status, those tend to be just swept under the rug and aggregated with the larger Muslim community. So we don't know about their experiences specifically, and that's something that we're wanting to expand on further. Specifically with my work with the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, we're looking at the experiences of marginalized women. So groups including Black Muslim women, refugee Muslim women, and so on, who we don't often hear from and we don't know what their experiences are like. So that's something that I hope MiCDI will address by having data sets that are large enough that include more representation of different kinds of Muslims across Canada. I think there was a second question that you mentioned, and I'm
just the work you've been doing with CCMW as well.
So I just mentioned that, yeah.
Well, let me take the last question, and then I'll also want to thank our panelists. The last question is, how do I get involved? How do I support this work? How do I get involved? And that's maybe probably the director's job to tell you that. And the data team are focused on the work itself. But how do you get involved? There's a number of ways to get involved. One is we are going to be continuing to have these webinar series. So part of the aim of the Institute and MiCDI is to enhance data literacy across a variety of sectors. It's not just an academic thing. It's not just for experts. It's for all of us, because public policy depends on it, and good democratic public policy that's informed is going to depend on all of us taking responsibility for the numbers that matter to us. And so being able to participate in these webinars, asking the tough questions, putting forth the kinds of priorities that you think are important are super important for us. So one was, we welcome you to join. We hope you'll come back next week for the next iteration of this. So that's number one. Number two, at the Institute, we host a series of, we have a paper series. Sarah has a couple reports already. I would recommend you take a look at them. I put the link in the chat function. And if you haven't taken a look at it, the 2019 report outlines some of the gaps in the literature that I think are important for you to take a look at, just to understand what the challenges are, what the limits are, and the gaps are. The previous Environics reports are incredibly important. Our hope is, of course, to increase the sample size to make it more representative. So those are all really important things for you to do right away. And of course, keep us, keep following our Twitter feed at the Institute. But I would be remiss, and my senior development officer would beat me if I didn't also say to you, we really need support. financial support for this project. It can't go forward if we don't have the financial support. We're halfway there. A project like this costs, creating data costs money. And so our model right now is to work with a variety of Muslim organizations that represent different stakeholder communities and ask them for financial support for this project. And through that, we develop a governance model to ensure that their constituencies feel well represented in the project. So if you're part of a community organization and this is something that you think would benefit you, we're really fortunate to have a number of leading community organizations supporting us. This is not the way I would have wanted to fund a project like this. I would have wanted to go through the federal government, through grants or whatnot. But the fact of the matter is that we're about to go through an election. There are no, those coffers are dried up or locked up until the election's over. And so, but the time for this project is now. We have the 2021 census now. We need to develop the Environics survey now so that there's coterminousness with the two data sets. Methodologically, we don't have the luxury of waiting. And so I believe in this project, the team believes in the project, and they're ready to go. And so our hope is that you'll contact us, contact me directly, or write us at the Institute, and we would love to hear from you and develop and create a relationship of support. But with that, with my last minute, I want to thank Abdie and Sarah for their presentation, for being here, for developing it. And again, this talk will be uploaded on the website next week. Sarah and Keith will be leading the next webinar to take us to the next stage of where we go from here. I hope you'll come and join us. So I want to thank the data team for being here and for coming across different time zones. And to the rest of you, all of you who joined, took some time out from your lunch hour to be with us today. Thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Have a good day.